Okay, welcome back to the channel. We're diving onward, I guess, into our journeys of working with CodeEngine. I would be lying if I'd said it was a joy, but it's a process to kind of like figure out how all of this is working. One of the questions that I came across was this question of like, what should you do in your CodeEngine function if you don't get a valid result from your API? Um, because, right, imagine you have this automation and it says, oh, go through and do this thing. What happens if I assume that I was successful with a step like, I don't know, share an account with a user or even create an account? What happens if I assume I'm successful in that step and I go on to this next step, but what if that step wasn't successful? What should we do? I guess we have a couple choices. I guess I could throw a response as false, or I could throw an, sorry, I said throw response as false. I could return false as a response, or I could throw an error. And those are not the same thing. Like one should like stop my code from executing, and the other one should just say, then I would just have to have a test for if true or false, and then like have an exit switch. Okay. I think this is important because when I was getting started writing code, I didn't test for success. I just assumed I was always successful, and that's not necessarily always the case. And also, like, you should build your assumptions into your error handling. So, for example, if you hit the um, query API, like, and you say, "Get me all of the pages that start with an asterisk," as long as you don't have a malformed request, you'll get a response, and that response might be an empty list saying that there are no pages that have an asterisk. Or in some cases, if you hit an API that truly does not exist, you get a 401 error, not a like empty object or empty dictionary, but an actual 401 error. And so you should build into your function design what does it mean if I hit an API that doesn't exist versus does it mean if I get a response that I'm not expecting from my API? Does that make sense? That's a lot of preamble. In the code here, anyway, as I look through the knowledge base of how to handle something like get account, in the end here they're saying if you don't have a response is okay, then you should throw an error and print the error. And you should not return false or whatever. And just keeping in mind, if I throw an error, there is no response. It just bubbles up, hey, there was an error. And then at the next layer up, I need to handle the error, or presumably, if I'm integrating this into a workflow, the workflow should error out gracefully or whatever it does. Okay, long story short, throw errors. How do I handle that in my code? So I am working on a set of functions that handle the accounts in Domo. Um, and you'll notice here in my CodeEngine request error, I've expanded this a little bit. So now instead of just passing in a message, I can also pass in my response object and a URL and my um, error message will either be the message you passed in, or it will give you your function name, the status of the response, and the actual response. So 403 error, here, let me just demo it. Here, I'll say get account from ID. The account 0 does not exist, so that should throw an error. And you can see here the response is not false, but here in my logs, I have a standard error. It says get account from ID is the name of the function. I got a 403 error, access is denied. Because this API, accounts 0, does not exist. I assume that's why we got that error. Okay, do. Let me demonstrate what happened. Well, I mean, we know if I don't throw an error, it should give me a response. Cool, so where do I call this error? In the previous tutorial, kind of glossed through it. Here's an example of calling this, or raising this error, rather, with a message. And then down as I'm implementing individual functions, let's call these root functions. I have a root function called getAccounts. This is the URL I want to hit. I say get data, return, oh, sorry, not that one. Get from ID, I get my response. What you should do in all of your roots, and I just haven't implemented it in get all accounts, is you should test for success. Or in my case, I have in my response object, I extended it to include is success. And then if it is false, then I can raise my error. And then if it doesn't raise an error, then return the response, which is what we had previously. In get data, I've extended get data now. Where's get data? Here's get data. Okay, so if I'm using requests.request, which again, we use that so I can sudo or impersonate another user, I get my response from the request library, and I store that as data, res.json. Response.json is the data. If the response is not okay, so 404, then what I'll return is the message, which was the account not found or whatever. I'll set is success equal to false, and I'll capture the status code. If the response is okay, then just toss in the data because that's exactly what we want. Now, if I hit CodeEngine, I'm pretty sure CodeEngine just throws an error. Sorry, CodeEngine send request. I'm pretty sure that just throws an error if I have a problem. So if I don't throw an error, then it must have been successful, and I'll just assume that the status was 200. So that's how I've extended get data. But if you were using my previous version of get data, it shouldn't impact you in any way, shape, or form, because in my software design, I try not to impact previous work by adding new features or functionality. And as all of my coworkers will tell you, sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not. Coming here to get accounts, let's implement the same thing. So I say, hey, I want to get data. And so my test should be if response.is success. So we'll say if not, then raise, and then I'm just going to copy paste this bit, just copy paste the whole thing. If not success, then raise the error, pass in the response, pass in the URL so I have a pretty response or a pretty error message. Otherwise, return res response. Okay. And save. Now you might be wondering, Jay, why did you create a whole new library? Why didn't you just add it to Python? Well, I work with all of the entities in Domo. So I work with many of the entities in Domo, so I will have to create a new library. Is this a library? A package? Whatever. A new one of these for each entity that I hit. Which Domo, if you're watching this, is super annoying because that means I get to configure get accounts, full session token, right, every single time, and there's like a bazillion parameters before I start dealing with getting accounts, right? I get to do this for each entity, and that's pretty obnoxious. It would be nice if I could like clone a package or just save this as its own library and access a library within a library. All right, enough of that. Back to work.